The dust kicked up by Samuel Crawford's horse settled slowly in the desert heat as he approached the outskirts of Copper Ridge. The town sat like a festering wound against the Arizona landscape, its wooden buildings weathered gray by years of relentless sun and wind. Samuel pulled his hat low over his eyes, scanning the main street with the practiced caution of a man who had learned that trouble often wore a friendly face. He had been riding for 3 days straight, following rumors and whispers that had reached him at a trading post near the Mexican border. 2 Apache girls, daughters of Chief Running Bear, were set to hang at dawn tomorrow. The charges were murder and theft, but Samuel knew better than to trust frontier justice when it came to Apache lives. He had seen too many innocent people swing from ropes simply because their skin was the wrong color, or they spoke the wrong language. Samuel dismounted outside Murphy's saloon, the largest building on the street. His boots crunched on the sandy ground as he tied his horse to the hitching post. The animal snorted and shook its head, sensing the tension that seemed to hang over the town like smoke. Through the batwing doors, Samuel could hear the low murmur of voices and the clink of glasses. He pushed through the doors and stepped inside. The saloon fell quiet as Samuel entered. Every eye turned toward him, taking in his weathered leather coat, the Colt revolver hanging low on his hip, and the determined set of his jaw. He was a tall man with sun-darkened skin and steel-gray eyes that missed nothing. A thin scar ran from his left temple to his cheek, a souvenir from an Apache war lance years ago. The bartender, a thick-set man with graying hair, wiped down a glass with mechanical precision. "What'll it be, stranger?" "Whiskey," Samuel said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "And information." The bartender poured the drink and slid it across the bar. "Information costs extra around here." Samuel placed a silver dollar on the bar, more money than most men in Copper Ridge saw in a week. "Tell me about the Apache girls in your jail." A nervous chuckle rippled through the saloon. The bartender glanced at the other patrons before leaning closer. "You mean the savages who murdered Tom Peterson and stole his cattle? They'll dance on air come morning and good riddance. What's your name?" Samuel asked quietly. "Murphy. This is my place." Samuel nodded slowly. "Murphy, I've been tracking outlaws and killers across 3 territories for the better part of 10 years. I can smell a lie from 100 yards away, and right now this whole town stinks of it." A chair scraped against the floor as a man stood up from a corner table. He was well dressed by frontier standards, with a clean white shirt and a black vest adorned with a gold watch chain. His face was pale despite the desert sun, suggesting he spent more time indoors than most men in these parts. "I'm Mayor Jacobson," the man said, straightening his vest. "I don't know what business brings you to Copper Ridge, stranger, but those Apache girls got a fair trial. They were caught red-handed with Peterson's stolen cattle, and Peterson himself was found dead with an Apache arrow in his back." Samuel turned slowly to face the mayor. "Funny thing about Apache arrows. I've seen enough of them to know that each tribe, each warrior even, has their own style of making them. The fletching, the arrowhead, the way they bind the point to the shaft. It's like a signature." "What's your point?" Mayor Jacobson asked, but there was a nervous edge to his voice now. "My point is that I'd be very interested to see this arrow that supposedly killed Peterson. Might tell us a lot about who really shot it." The mayor's face flushed red. "Now see here, you can't just ride into our town and start making accusations. We've got law and order here. Where's your sheriff?" Samuel asked, looking around the saloon. "Sheriff Martinez is indisposed at the moment," Murphy said quickly. "Deputy Williams is handling things." Samuel finished his whiskey in one swallow and set the glass down with a sharp click. "Well then, I reckon I should introduce myself to Deputy Williams. Name's Samuel Crawford, by the way. Some folks call me the Lone Rider." The name hit the room like a thunderclap. Samuel Crawford was known from California to Texas as a man who brought justice to places where law was nothing but a word painted on a tin badge. He had tracked down the Mendez gang, brought in Black Jack Morrison alive, and once rode alone into a Comanche camp to negotiate the release of captives. His reputation was built on fairness, courage, and an unwavering commitment to the truth. Mayor Jacobson's face went white. "Now, Mr. Crawford, there's no need for any trouble here. Everything's been handled proper and legal." "I'm sure it has," Samuel said with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But I'd still like to see those girls and hear their side of the story. Where's your jail?" "End of the street next to the general store," Murphy said reluctantly. But Crawford, you should know that feelings are running pretty high in this town. Folks don't take kindly to Indian lovers. Samuel's hand moved almost imperceptibly closer to his gun. And I don't take kindly to folks who let innocent people hang because it's convenient.
We understand each other, Murphy?
The bartender nodded quickly, sweat beading on his forehead despite the relative coolness of the saloon's interior. Samuel touched the brim of his hat in a mock salute and walked toward the doors. As he pushed through them, he could hear the excited whispers starting up behind him. The jail was exactly where Murphy had said it would be. A squat adobe building with barred windows and a heavy wooden door. Samuel could see a thin trickle of smoke rising from the chimney, suggesting someone was inside. He approached the door and knocked twice. "Who is it?" Came a young voice from inside. "Samuel Crawford. I'd like to speak with Deputy Williams." The door opened slowly, revealing a boy who couldn't have been more than 19 years old. He wore a badge that looked too big for his slight frame, and his hand rested nervously on the butt of his revolver. "You're the lone rider," the deputy said, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and fear. "What brings you to Copper Ridge?" "Justice," Samuel said simply. "I hear you've got 2 Apache girls set to hang tomorrow. I'd like to see them." Deputy Williams shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. "I don't know, Mr. Crawford. Mayor Jacobson gave strict orders that nobody was to see the prisoners except the preacher." "Son, what's your first name?" "Billy, sir." Samuel placed a gentle but firm hand on the young man's shoulder. "Billy, I can see you're trying to do right by your badge. But sometimes doing right means more than just following orders. Those girls in there, they're somebody's daughters. They deserve to have their story heard before they die." Billy Williams looked up into Samuel's weathered face and saw something there that spoke to the better angels of his nature. Slowly, he stepped aside and gestured for Samuel to enter the jail. The jail's interior was dim and stifling, lit only by a single oil lamp hanging from a hook near Deputy Williams's desk. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, fear, and desperation. 2 cells lined the back wall, separated by thick iron bars that cast long shadows across the dirt floor. In the cell on the right, Samuel could make out 2 figures huddled together in the far corner. "Girls," Billy called out softly, "there's someone here to see you." The figures stirred, and Samuel could see them more clearly now. They were young, perhaps 16 and 18 years old, with the distinctive features and long black hair of the Apache people. Their clothes were torn and dirty, and their faces bore the marks of rough treatment. But their eyes, when they looked at Samuel, burned with a defiance that prison bars couldn't contain. The older girl stood slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. She stepped into the light, and Samuel could see the proud bearing that marked her as the daughter of a chief. Despite her circumstances, she held her head high and met his gaze directly. "Who are you, white man?" she asked in accented but clear English. "Have you come to watch us die?" "My name is Samuel Crawford," he said, removing his hat respectfully. "I've come to hear your story." The younger girl remained in the shadows, but Samuel could hear her quiet sobbing. The older one, who seemed to be protecting her sister, studied Samuel for a long moment before speaking again. "I am Swift Deer," she said. "This is my sister, Singing Bird. We are daughters of Chief Running Bear of the Chiricahua Apache. They say we are murderers and thieves, but we speak only truth." Samuel pulled up a wooden chair and sat down facing the cell. "Tell me what happened, Swift Deer. Tell me everything." Swift Deer glanced at Deputy Williams, who had taken a seat at his desk but was listening intently. She seemed to weigh her words carefully before beginning her story. 3 days ago, we were returning from gathering medicine plants in the hills east of here. Our people suffer from the white man's spotted fever, and the plants we seek grow only in certain places. We had permission from the Indian agent to leave the reservation for this purpose. She paused, her eyes distant with memory. We were camped near Willow Creek when we heard gunshots in the distance. Many gunshots, like a battle. Singing Bird wanted to flee, but I thought someone might need help. We rode toward the sound. Samuel leaned forward slightly. "What did you find?" "We found the white man, Peterson, lying in the grass beside his wagon. He had been shot 3 times in the chest, and there was much blood. His cattle were scattered, some dead, some running wild. We saw no one else. Did you see any arrows in the body?" Swift Deer shook her head firmly. "No arrows. Only bullet wounds. But when we approached to see if the man still lived, we heard riders coming. Benny riders moving fast. We hid in the rocks and watched. Billy Williams had stopped pretending to work on his papers and was listening openly now. Samuel noticed the young deputy's growing interest and continued his questioning. What did you see? 5 white men rode up to where Peterson lay. Their leader was a big man with yellow hair and a red beard. He spoke to the others, but we were too far to hear the words clearly. Then one of the men took something from his saddlebag and pushed it into Peterson's back. Samuel's jaw tightened. An arrow? Yes, an Apache arrow. We could see the feathers from where we hid. The big man laughed when it was done, and they began to gather the cattle that were still alive. Can you describe any of the other men? Swift Deer closed her eyes, concentrating. One was very thin with dark hair and a scar on his face here, she said, drawing a line across her cheek. Another was short and fat with no hair on his head. The others I did not see clearly, but they all wore guns and moved like men who were comfortable with violence. Samuel nodded thoughtfully. The description of the leader matched someone he had encountered before, though he couldn't quite place the memory. What happened next? They drove the cattle south toward the border. We waited until they were gone, then approached the body again. We wanted to remove the arrow because we knew what it would mean for our people if it was found. But before we could touch it, more riders came. Singing Bird finally spoke from the shadows, her voice barely above a whisper. Sheriff Martinez and 3 other men. They saw us near the body and immediately drew their guns. They would not listen to our words. Sheriff Martinez arrested you himself? Samuel asked, surprised. Swift Deer nodded. He said we were caught red-handed with stolen cattle, though the only cattle near us were the dead ones. He said the arrow proved our guilt, and that we would hang for our crimes. He brought us here and left us with the boy deputy. Samuel turned to Billy Williams, who was shifting uncomfortably in his chair. Billy, where is Sheriff Martinez now? The young deputy's face flushed red. He left town yesterday morning, said he had business in Tucson that couldn't wait. Mighty convenient timing, Samuel said dryly. Billy, did you see any cattle when they brought these girls in? Billy shook his head reluctantly. No, sir. No cattle at all. I asked about that, actually. The sheriff said the cattle had been recovered and returned to Peterson's ranch. Samuel stood and began pacing the small room, his mind working through the implications of what he had heard. The story the girls told made sense in a way that the official version did not. Apache raiders typically struck fast and moved quickly back to the safety of their territory. They rarely lingered at the scene of an attack, and they certainly wouldn't camp nearby with stolen cattle where they could easily be discovered. Swift Deer, the man with the yellow hair and red beard. Have you seen him before? She considered the question carefully. Perhaps. 3 moons ago, there was a man who came to our reservation. He spoke with the Indian agent about buying cattle. He had such hair, though I did not see him clearly. The agent sent him away saying our cattle were not for sale. Samuel's memory suddenly crystallized. Big Jim Tolliver, a cattle rustler who had been working the Arizona territory for years. Samuel had nearly caught up with him outside Phoenix 6 months ago, but Tolliver had escaped into Mexico with a stolen herd. The man was known for his cunning and his complete lack of conscience when it came to putting the blame for his crimes on others. Billy, Samuel said, turning to the deputy, I need you to think carefully about something. Has anyone else been asking questions about these girls? Anyone shown particular interest in seeing them hang? The young man frowned, clearly struggling with something. Well, Mayor Jacobson has been real insistent that the execution happen on schedule. And there was a stranger in town 2 days ago, a big man with yellow hair. He had a drink with the mayor and left before nightfall. Swift Deer gasped and grabbed the bars of her cell. That was him. The man we saw at Peterson's body. Samuel felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always came when he was close to the truth. Big Jim Tolliver had orchestrated the perfect crime. Murder Peterson, steal his cattle, plant an Apache arrow to blame the Indians, and then make sure the only witnesses were hanged before they could tell their story. It was clever, ruthless, and would have worked perfectly if Samuel hadn't happened to be in the territory. But knowing the truth and proving it were 2 different things. The girl's testimony alone wouldn't be enough to convince a judge or jury, especially with anti-Apache sentiment running high in the territory. Samuel needed evidence, and he needed it before dawn. Billy, I need you to do something for me, Samuel said, his voice urgent. I need you to delay this execution until I can investigate further. The deputy shook his head miserably. I can't do that, Mr. Crawford. Mayor Jacobson would have my badge, and probably worse. The whole town's worked up about this. They want to see justice done. This isn't justice, Billy, this is murder. And if you let it happen, You'll have to live with it for the rest of your life. Samuel could see the internal struggle playing out on the young man's face. Billy Williams had become a deputy to help people and uphold the law, not to be complicit in a lynching disguised as legal execution. There might be a way, Billy said finally, his voice barely audible. The execution's set for dawn, but the hangman won't work in the dark. If something happened to the gallows during the night, Samuel nodded grimly. You didn't hear that suggestion from me, Billy, and if anyone asks, I was never here. Samuel left the jail as quietly as he had entered, his mind already formulating a plan. The moon was rising, casting pale silver light across the dusty streets of Copper Ridge. Most of the town had settled in for the night, though he could still hear voices and laughter drifting from Murphy's saloon. The gallows stood in the town square like a dark monument to frontier justice, its crossbeam casting an ominous shadow across the ground. He made his way back to his horse, checking his gear with the methodical care of a man who had learned that preparation often meant the difference between life and death. His rifle was clean and loaded, his revolver checked twice, and his saddlebags contained enough supplies for several days on the trail. But first he needed to gather evidence that would clear the Apache girls and expose the real killers. Samuel mounted his horse and rode slowly out of town, heading toward the Peterson Ranch. The property lay about 5 miles north of Copper Ridge, in a valley surrounded by low hills covered with scrub oak and mesquite. As he rode, he considered what Swift Deer had told him. If Big Jim Tolliver and his gang had stolen Peterson's cattle and driven them south toward Mexico, there would be tracks. Cattle left clear signs when they were moved in large numbers, and Tolliver was too confident in his scheme to worry about covering his trail. The Peterson Ranch was a modest affair, consisting of a small adobe house, a barn, and several corrals. Even in the moonlight, Samuel could see that the place had been abandoned hastily. The front door hung open, banging gently in the night breeze, and papers scattered across the yard suggested someone had gone through Peterson's belongings with little care for neatness. Samuel dismounted and ground-tied his horse near the corral. He lit a small lantern from his saddlebags and began examining the area around the house. The ground was hard-packed dirt, baked solid by the Arizona sun, but Samuel had learned to read sign on terrain that would stump most trackers. Near the barn, he found what he was looking for: the unmistakable signs of a large cattle herd being gathered and moved. The tracks were 3 days old, but clear enough to follow. More importantly, they headed south, just as Swift Deer had said. No Apache raiding party would drive stolen cattle toward Mexico. They would head east, toward their traditional strongholds in the mountains. But tracks alone wouldn't convince a territorial judge. Samuel needed something more concrete, something that would directly link Tolliver to Peterson's murder. He made his way to the spot where, according to Swift Deer's description, Peterson's body had been found. The area had been disturbed by many feet, but Samuel's trained eye could still make out the basic pattern of what had happened. There were clear signs of a struggle near the overturned wagon. Scuff marks in the dirt, scattered personal belongings, and dark stains that could only be blood. But most telling were the boot prints. Samuel knelt and examined them carefully by lantern light. 5 different sets, just as Swift Deer had described. And there, preserved in a patch of softer ground near a water trough, was a clear print that made Samuel's pulse quicken. The boot had a distinctive wear pattern on the heel and a nail missing from the sole. Samuel had seen that exact print before, outside a bank in Yuma where Big Jim Tolliver had killed a guard during a robbery attempt. It wasn't proof that would hold up in court by itself, but it confirmed what Samuel already suspected. As he was studying the tracks, Samuel heard the sound of approaching horses. He quickly extinguished his lantern and moved into the shadows of the barn, drawing his revolver. 3 riders approached the ranch house, moving cautiously in the moonlight. Samuel recognized Mayor Jacobson's voice immediately. "Are you sure he came out here?" Jacobson was saying to his companions. Murphy saw him asking questions about the Peterson business, another voice replied. And Billy said he was real interested in hearing the Apache girl's story. "We can't let him stir up trouble now, not when we're so close to finishing this thing." The 3rd rider, a man with a gravelly voice that Samuel didn't recognize, laughed harshly. "Should have listened to Tolliver and killed those girls the night we caught them. All this legal nonsense is just asking for complications." Mayor Jacobson's response chilled Samuel's blood. "The legal way gives us cover. Nobody can say we didn't follow proper procedure. Besides, when those girls hang tomorrow, the whole Peterson business is closed forever. No loose ends. And what about this Crawford character? The gravelly voice asked. He's got a reputation for being stubborn about these things. Crawford's just one man, Jacobson said with confidence. If he tries to interfere with the execution, well, accidents happen, especially to men who stick their noses where they don't belong. Samuel listened as the three men searched the ranch house, looking for any sign of his presence. They were thorough but not particularly skilled, and after 20 minutes they remounted their horses and rode back toward town. Samuel waited another 10 minutes to be sure they were gone before lighting his lantern again and continuing his investigation. In the house, he found Peterson's personal papers scattered across the floor. Most were routine ranch business, but one document caught his attention. It was a letter from the territorial cattle inspector, dated just a week before Peterson's death. The letter commended Peterson for his cooperation in reporting suspicious cattle movements in the area and requested that he continue to watch for signs of rustling operations. Samuel folded the letter carefully and placed it in his coat pocket. Peterson had been working with the territorial authorities to stop cattle rustling. That gave Tolliver a clear motive for murder beyond simple theft. Peterson was a threat to the entire operation, and Tolliver had eliminated that threat in typically brutal fashion. But Samuel still needed to find the stolen cattle, or some other physical evidence linking Tolliver to the crime. The trail headed south from the ranch, and Samuel knew that Tolliver often used a network of hidden camps and relay points to move stolen livestock to buyers in Mexico. There was one such camp about 20 miles south of Copper Ridge, in a box canyon that provided perfect concealment for illegal activities. Samuel mounted his horse and began following the cattle trail south. The tracks were easy to follow in the moonlight, cutting a clear path across the desert floor. As he rode, he kept one eye on the trail and the other on his surroundings, watching for any sign of Tolliver's men. The rustler was known for posting guards at strategic points along his routes, and Samuel had no desire to ride into an ambush. The trail wound through a series of low hills and dry washes before entering rougher country where ancient volcanic activity had left the landscape broken and scarred. Samuel knew this territory well from his years tracking outlaws, and he recognized the landmarks that marked the approach to Dead Man's Canyon, one of Tolliver's favorite hideouts. As he neared the canyon mouth, Samuel dismounted and proceeded on foot, leading his horse carefully over the rocky ground to avoid making noise. The canyon walls rose steeply on both sides, creating perfect acoustic conditions for detecting any sound within. Samuel could hear the low lowing of cattle echoing off the rock walls, confirming that he had found what he was looking for. He made his way up a goat path that led to a vantage point overlooking the canyon floor. What he saw below made his jaw clench with anger. Nearly 200 head of cattle were penned in a natural corral at the far end of the canyon. But more importantly, 5 men sat around a campfire, sharing a bottle and talking in the casual manner of men who believed themselves perfectly safe. Even at this distance, Samuel could make out the distinctive figure of Big Jim Tolliver, his massive frame and red-gold beard unmistakable in the firelight. The rustler was counting money, apparently dividing up the proceeds from selling Peterson's cattle to Mexican buyers. Samuel began working his way down into the canyon, moving with the stealth that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations. If he could capture Tolliver and force a confession, the Apache girls would be saved and justice would finally be served. But 5-to-1 odds in rough terrain were not favorable, even for a man of Samuel's skills. As he crept closer to the camp, Samuel could hear fragments of the conversation around the fire. Tolliver was boasting about how perfectly his plan had worked, how the stupid townspeople of Copper Ridge had swallowed his story completely. By tomorrow night, Tolliver was saying, those Apache girls will be nothing but buzzard bait, and will be across the border with enough money to live like kings for months. One of his men, the thin, scarred man Swift Deer had described, laughed and raised his bottle in a toast. Here's to Big Jim Tolliver, the smartest man in the Arizona Territory. Samuel had heard enough. It was time to act. Samuel studied the layout of the camp with a predator's patience. Tolliver and his men had grown careless in their confidence, positioning themselves in a tight circle around the fire with their backs to the canyon walls. Their horses were picketed nearby, but their weapons were stacked carelessly against a fallen log, just far enough away to matter in a fight. The smart play would be to ride back to town and gather a posse, but Samuel knew that Copper Ridge was too corrupted by Tolliver's influence to provide reliable help. Mayor Jacobson was clearly in on the scheme, and there was no telling how many other townspeople were either bought off or intimidated into silence. Besides, dawn was only a few hours away, and the Apache girls would be dead long before Samuel could organize any kind of official response. Samuel began moving through the shadows at the edge of the canyon, using every rock and bush for cover. His years of experience had taught him that surprise was often more valuable than superior numbers, especially when dealing with men who had grown comfortable in their criminality. He needed to get close enough to take at least two of them out of the fight before they could react. The wind was in his favor, carrying his scent away from the camp and masking any small sounds he might make. Samuel reached a position about 30 yards from the fire, close enough to hear every word of the conversation, but still concealed in the darkness beyond the circle of light. "I still say we should have killed Crawford when we had the chance," the scarred man was saying. "Man like that doesn't give up easy." Tolliver spat into the fire, causing it to hiss and flare. "Crawford's just one man, and he's got no proof of anything. By the time he figures out what really happened, we'll be long gone, and those Apache girls will be too dead to talk." "What about the deputy?" asked the short, bald man Swift Deer had described. "Kid seemed nervous when I saw him earlier. What if he grows a conscience? Billy Williams?" Tolliver laughed harshly. "That boy's scared of his own shadow. He'll do what he's told and keep his mouth shut, or he'll find himself in a shallow grave next to Peterson." Samuel had heard enough. He drew his revolver and stepped into the circle of firelight, his weapon trained on Tolliver's chest. "Evening, gentlemen. Nice night for a confession." The 5 men froze, their hands moving instinctively toward their weapons before they realized their guns were out of reach. Tolliver's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, calculation, and finally a grudging respect. "Well, well," the big rustler said slowly. "The famous lone rider. Heard a lot about you, Crawford. Heard you were smart, but riding into our camp alone suggests otherwise. I've been called worse things by better men," Samuel replied evenly, his gun never wavering. "Jim Tolliver, you're under arrest for the murder of Tom Peterson and the theft of his cattle. You boys are welcome to surrender peacefully, or we can do this the hard way." The scarred man shifted slightly and Samuel's gun swung toward him. "I wouldn't, friend. I can put 3 bullets in you before you take 2 steps. You can't watch all of us, Crawford," Tolliver said with false confidence. 5 guns against 1, even yours. The math don't work in your favor," Samuel smiled coldly. "Maybe not. But I guarantee you'll be the first to die, Jim. Question is whether that's a trade your boys are willing to make." For a moment, nobody moved. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the distant lowing of the stolen cattle. Then the youngest of Tolliver's men, a kid who couldn't have been more than 20, slowly raised his hands. "I surrender, mister," the kid said, his voice shaking. "I didn't sign up for murder, just cattle rustling." "Shut up, Tommy," Tolliver snarled, but the damage was done. The young outlaw's words had as good as confessed to Peterson's murder. "Smart boy," Samuel said approvingly. "Tommy, is it?" "Tommy, I want you to very slowly pick up that rope by the fire and tie up your friend's hands. Start with the gentleman next to you." Tommy began following Samuel's instructions, but Samuel could see that Tolliver was calculating his options. The big rustler was a dangerous man who had killed before, and wouldn't hesitate to do so again. Samuel needed to end this confrontation before it turned into a bloodbath. "You know, Jim," Samuel said conversationally, "I've been tracking you for months, ever since you hit that bank in Yuma and killed that guard. Left quite a trail, you did." Tolliver's eyes narrowed. "You can't prove anything about Yuma." "Maybe not in court," Samuel admitted. "But I found some interesting boot prints at Peterson's ranch. Same distinctive wear pattern as the tracks outside that bank. Funny how a man's walk leaves such a unique signature." "Circumstantial evidence," Tolliver said, but sweat was beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. "Maybe. But add in the testimony of 2 Apache girls who saw you plant that arrow in Peterson's back, plus Tommy here admitting to the cattle rustling, and you're looking at a rope around your neck." Samuel could see that Tolliver was running out of options. The rustler's hand was edging slowly toward a hidden derringer in his boot, but Samuel was ready for such a move. Years of tracking desperate men had taught him to watch for the telltale signs of a last-ditch attack. "Problem with your plan?" Jim, is that it depended on those Apache girls dying before they could tell their story. But I've talked to them, and their testimony will clear them and put you in their place on that gallows. Indian testimony don't count for nothing in a white man's court, Tolliver said, but his voice lacked conviction. Normally you'd be right, Samuel agreed. But when that testimony is backed up by physical evidence and the word of Samuel Crawford, judges tend to listen. You made one big mistake, Jim. You got greedy and stayed in the territory too long. Tolliver's hand moved toward his boot, but Samuel was faster. His Colt barked once, and the rustler's hat flew off his head, singed by the passing bullet. The other outlaws froze, and Tolliver slowly raised his hands. Next one goes through your heart, Jim, Samuel said quietly. Your choice. The fight went out of Tolliver like air from a punctured bladder. He looked around at his men, all of whom were now staring at him with expressions ranging from fear to disgust. His grand plan had collapsed, and he knew it. All right, Crawford, Tolliver said heavily. You win this hand, but don't expect me to make it easy for you. Samuel kept his gun trained on the rustlers while Tommy finished tying them up. The young outlaw was clearly relieved to be out of the gang, and Samuel suspected he would turn state's evidence in exchange for a lighter sentence. Tommy, Samuel said, you seem like a basically decent kid who fell in with bad company. You willing to testify against Tolliver and the others? The young man nodded eagerly. Yes, sir. I'll tell everything I know. I never wanted any part of killing Mr. Peterson. We were just supposed to steal his cattle. Tolliver glared at his former associate with undisguised hatred. You always were weak, Tommy. Should have known you'd turn yellow when things got rough. Better yellow than a murderer. Tommy shot back with surprising spirit. Samuel began gathering the outlaw's weapons while keeping one eye on his prisoners. The stolen cattle would serve as additional evidence, and with Tommy's testimony and the girls' account of what they had witnessed, the case against Tolliver was solid. But Samuel knew that getting back to Copper Ridge alive would be the real challenge. Mayor Jacobson and his allies would not be happy to see their carefully constructed frame-up falling apart. They had too much invested in seeing the Apache girls hang to give up without a fight. As Samuel prepared to move out with his prisoners, he heard the sound of approaching horses echoing off the canyon walls. Someone was coming, and given the hour and the location, it was unlikely to be anyone friendly. Expecting company, Jim? Samuel asked. Tolliver's face split into an ugly grin. Matter of fact, I am. Told the mayor I'd send word if anyone came sniffing around. Looks like he decided not to wait for that message. Samuel counted at least 6 horses approaching the canyon mouth. Mayor Jacobson had apparently brought reinforcements to deal with the troublesome lone rider. Samuel quickly assessed his options. The canyon walls offered some protection, but they also created a trap if he couldn't find another way out. Tommy, Samuel said urgently, is there another way out of this canyon? The young outlaw nodded toward the far end where the cattle were penned. There's a narrow trail that leads up the back wall. Real steep, but a good horse can make it. Samuel made his decision quickly. We're moving. Tommy, you're going to help me get these men to that trail. Anyone tries anything stupid, they'll answer to my Colt. The approaching riders were getting closer, their voices echoing off the canyon walls as they called out to Tolliver. Samuel pushed his prisoners toward the back of the canyon, using the scattered rocks and brush for cover. The stolen cattle became restless as the group passed through them, their lowing adding to the confusion. Behind them, Samuel could hear Mayor Jacobson's voice calling out. Jim, you in there? We saw Crawford's horse tracks leading this way. Tolliver opened his mouth to respond, but Samuel pressed the barrel of his revolver against the rustler's neck. One word and it'll be your last. They reached the base of the trail Tommy had indicated. It was indeed steep, little more than a goat path winding up the canyon wall through loose rock and scrub vegetation. Samuel could see that getting 5 bound men up that trail would be nearly impossible, especially with armed pursuers closing in behind them. Change of plans, Samuel said grimly. Tommy, you're coming with me as a witness. The rest of you are staying here. You can't leave us tied up with Jacobson coming, the scarred man protested. He'll kill us to keep us quiet. Samuel considered this for a moment. The man was probably right. Jacobson couldn't afford to have Tolliver's gang captured alive, not when they could testify to his involvement in the conspiracy. But Samuel also couldn't risk letting dangerous criminals loose. Your choice is simple, Samuel told them. Stay here tied up and take your chances with Jacobson, or come with me and face a judge. But if you come with me, Any man who tries to escape or cause trouble gets a bullet. The sound of horses entering the canyon made the decision urgent. 3 of the outlaws chose to follow Samuel up the trail, while the scarred man elected to remain behind, apparently preferring to take his chances with the mayor rather than face frontier justice. Samuel cut the ropes binding the 3 who had chosen to come with him, but kept their hands tied in front so they could climb. Tommy led the way up the treacherous path, followed by the 3 prisoners, with Samuel bringing up the rear where he could watch everyone. The climb was harrowing. Loose rocks scattered under their feet, threatening to start an avalanche that would alert their pursuers below. Samuel's horse, trained for mountain work, handled the trail well, but the outlaws struggled with their bound hands and growing exhaustion. Halfway up the canyon wall, they could hear shouting from below as Mayor Jacobson's party discovered the camp. Samuel caught fragments of angry conversation as the mayor realized that his carefully laid plans were falling apart. Then came the sound that chilled Samuel's blood, a single gunshot echoing off the canyon walls. "Sounds like your friend just outlived his usefulness," Samuel told Tolliver grimly. The big rustler's face had gone pale. "Jacobson's cleaning house. He'll kill anyone who can connect him to this business." They reached the top of the canyon wall just as the first rays of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Samuel realized with a start that the execution was scheduled for sunrise, now less than an hour away. He had to get back to Copper Ridge immediately if there was any chance of saving Swift Deer and Singing Bird. "Tommy," Samuel said, mounting his horse, "you know this country. What's the fastest way back to town from here?" The young outlaw pointed toward a series of low ridges to the east. "There's an old mining road about 2 miles that way. Rough riding, but it cuts the distance in half." Samuel nodded and spurred his horse toward the ridges, driving his prisoners ahead of him at a punishing pace. Behind them, he could hear more gunshots from the canyon, suggesting that Jacobson was indeed eliminating witnesses. The mayor was probably assuming that Samuel had died in the canyon along with Tolliver's gang, which would make his appearance in town all the more dramatic. As they rode hard across the broken terrain, Samuel's mind was already working on how to handle the situation in Copper Ridge. Simply arriving with prisoners and testimony might not be enough to stop the execution, especially if the crowd was worked up for a lynching. He needed to create enough doubt and confusion to force a delay, then present his evidence in a way that would convince even the most prejudiced townspeople. The sun was rising rapidly now, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and red. Samuel pushed his exhausted horse harder, knowing that 2 innocent lives hung in the balance. Behind him, his prisoners struggled to keep up, their faces grim with the knowledge that their own survival depended on Samuel's success. In the distance, Samuel could see the buildings of Copper Ridge emerging from the morning haze. Smoke was rising from several chimneys, and he could make out figures moving in the streets. The town was waking up, preparing for what they believed would be a just execution, but what Samuel knew would be nothing short of murder. Time was running out, but the lone rider had faced impossible odds before. As he rode toward the final confrontation, Samuel Crawford prepared to stake everything on one last desperate gamble, to save 2 innocent lives and expose the corruption that had nearly claimed them. Samuel could see the crowd gathering in the town square as he crested the final hill, overlooking Copper Ridge. Even from a distance, he could sense the ugly mood that had taken hold of the townspeople. Men, women, and even children were streaming toward the gallows, their faces animated with the savage excitement that seemed to possess civilized people when they gathered to watch someone die. The gallows stood in the center of the square, its crossbeam dark against the brightening sky. 2 nooses dangled from the beam, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. Samuel could see that someone had repaired the damage that Billy Williams had apparently inflicted during the night. The young deputy had tried to delay the execution, but the townspeople's bloodlust had overcome his sabotage. Samuel drove his prisoners harder, his horse's hooves thundering on the hard-packed road leading into town. Tommy rode beside him, while Tolliver and the other 2 outlaws followed closely behind, their faces grim with exhaustion and fear. They knew that their only hope of avoiding summary execution lay in Samuel's ability to convince the crowd of their testimony's truth. As they entered the main street, heads began to turn. Samuel could see the surprise and confusion on people's faces as they recognized the famous lone rider, followed by men they had never seen before. Word spread quickly through the crowd, and by the time Samuel reached the town square, hundreds of eyes were fixed on his small procession. Near the gallows, Samuel could see a group of town officials huddled together in urgent conversation. He recognized several faces from his brief visit to Murphy's saloon, but notably absent was Mayor Jacobson. The mayor was probably still in the canyon, cleaning up the evidence of his involvement in Peterson's murder. "Citizens of Copper Ridge," Samuel called out, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "I am Samuel Crawford, and I bring evidence that will prove the innocence of the Apache girls you're about to hang." A murmur ran through the crowd, ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Samuel could see that many of the townspeople were already drunk, despite the early hour, having worked themselves into a frenzy for the execution. Changing their minds would be like stopping a flash flood with bare hands. An older man with a silver beard and a black suit stepped forward from the group of officials. Samuel assumed this was the judge who would oversee the execution, probably brought in from the territorial capital for the occasion. "Mr. Crawford," the judge said in a carrying voice, "while your reputation precedes you, this matter has been settled by due process of law. These Apache women were given a fair trial and found guilty by a jury of their peers." "Judge," Samuel called back, "what you call due process was nothing but a frame-up designed to cover up the real crime. The man who actually murdered Tom Peterson is sitting right here in front of you." Samuel gestured toward Tolliver, who sat slumped in his saddle like a defeated giant. The crowd pressed closer, their anger now mixed with confusion and uncertainty. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Crawford," the judge said cautiously. "Do you have evidence to support such a claim?" "I have the testimony of this man," Samuel pointed to Tommy, "who witnessed the murder. I have physical evidence from Peterson's ranch proving that 5 men, not Apache raiders, committed this crime. And I have the stolen cattle themselves, hidden in a canyon 20 miles south of here." The crowd was growing restless, some calling for the execution to proceed while others demanded to hear more of Samuel's evidence. Samuel could see that he was losing them. The mob mentality was too strong, the prejudice against Apache people too deeply ingrained to be overcome by reason alone. Then he saw Billy Williams pushing through the crowd, the young deputy's face pale but determined. Behind him came Swift Deer and Singing Bird, no longer in chains but surrounded by several armed men Samuel didn't recognize. The girls looked terrified but defiant, their eyes searching the hostile faces around them for any sign of sympathy. "Deputy Williams," Samuel called out, "bring those girls forward. Let them tell their story to these people." Billy nodded and began pushing through the crowd, but his progress was blocked by a group of rough-looking men who seemed to be taking orders from someone Samuel couldn't see. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Samuel realized that words alone wouldn't be enough to save the Apache girls. Then a new voice cut through the noise of the crowd, calm but carrying an unmistakable note of authority. "Let them through. Everyone deserves to be heard before they die." The crowd parted, and Samuel saw an elderly Apache man walking slowly toward the gallows. He was tall and dignified despite his age, wearing traditional clothes but carrying himself with the bearing of a chief. Behind him walked a small group of Apache warriors, their faces painted for war but their weapons conspicuously absent. "I am Running Bear," the old man announced, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet square. "These are my daughters you seek to kill. I have come to hear the words spoken against them, and to speak words in their defense." The appearance of Chief Running Bear changed the entire dynamic of the situation. Even the most prejudiced townspeople recognized the courage it took for an Apache leader to walk unarmed into a hostile white settlement. More importantly, his presence reminded everyone that the girls about to be executed were human beings with family and loved ones, not faceless savages. "Chief Running Bear," Samuel said respectfully, removing his hat, "I have evidence that your daughters are innocent of the charges against them. The real killers are here, and they're ready to confess their crimes." Running Bear turned his piercing gaze on Tolliver and his men, studying them with the intensity of a hawk examining its prey. "These men killed the white rancher?" "Yes," Samuel said firmly. "And they planted an Apache arrow in his body to make it look like your people were responsible." A collective gasp went up from the crowd. Even in a territory where relations between whites and Apaches were often violent, the deliberate framing of innocent people for murder was considered beyond the pale. The judge stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the way events were unfolding. "Mr. Crawford, these are serious allegations. If you have evidence, it should be presented in a proper court of law, not in the public square. Judge, Samuel said, his voice taking on a hard edge, the people of this town are about to commit murder in the name of justice. There's no time for proper procedures when innocent lives are at stake. Tommy chose that moment to speak up, his young voice cracking with emotion. He's telling the truth. We killed Peterson for his cattle, and Big Jim made us plant that Apache arrow to throw off suspicion. Those girls never hurt nobody. The crowd erupted in angry shouts and confused questions. Some people were calling Tommy a liar, while others were demanding to know why they should believe a confessed criminal. Samuel could see that the situation was about to spiral completely out of control. Then Chief Running Bear raised his hand, and somehow his simple gesture commanded more attention than all the shouting and arguing. In my tribe, the old chief said quietly, when there is doubt about guilt, we do not kill until the truth is known. This is wisdom. Indian wisdom don't count for much here, old man, someone shouted from the back of the crowd. Running Bear turned toward the voice, his dignity unshaken. Then perhaps that is why there is so much killing in your world, and so little justice. Samuel seized the moment to press his advantage. Judge, I'm asking for 24 hours to present my evidence properly. If I can't prove these girls' innocence in that time, I'll personally escort them back to this gallows. The judge looked around at the crowd, clearly torn between his duty to uphold the law and his growing doubts about the case. Samuel could see that the man was honest, probably appointed to his position based on legal knowledge rather than political connections. The law requires that all evidence be properly examined, the judge said finally. Deputy Williams returned the prisoners to their cells. This execution is postponed pending a review of new evidence. The crowd's reaction was explosive. Some people cheered, others booed angrily, and a few began pushing toward the gallows as if they intended to carry out the execution themselves, regardless of the judge's decision. Samuel saw several men reaching for guns, and he knew that the situation was about to turn deadly. That's when the missing piece of the puzzle finally arrived. Sheriff Martinez came riding hard down the main street, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with urgency. Behind him rode a full squadron of territorial cavalry, their blue uniforms and disciplined formation a stark contrast to the chaotic mob in the town square. Stand down, all of you, Martinez shouted as he dismounted near the gallows. By order of the territorial government, I'm taking these prisoners into protective custody, pending a full investigation. Samuel felt a surge of relief mixed with suspicion. Where had Martinez been for the past 2 days, and why was he suddenly appearing with military backup? The timing seemed too convenient to be coincidental. Sheriff Martinez dismounted and strode toward Samuel with the confident bearing of a man who finally held all the cards. The cavalry squadron formed a protective perimeter around the gallows, their presence immediately calming the more volatile members of the crowd. Samuel studied the sheriff's face, looking for any sign of deception or hidden agenda. Crawford, Martinez said, extending his hand in greeting. I owe you an apology and an explanation. I know my disappearance looks suspicious, but I was following orders from the territorial governor himself. Samuel shook the offered hand cautiously. What kind of orders? Martinez glanced around at the crowd, many of whom were still grumbling about the postponed execution. The kind that required me to pretend to be corrupt while we investigated a cattle rustling operation that reached all the way to the territorial capital. We've been tracking Big Jim Tolliver for months, waiting for him to lead us to his partners in the government. The pieces began falling into place in Samuel's mind. You knew about the frame-up from the beginning. We suspected it, Martinez confirmed. When Tolliver's gang hit Peterson's ranch, we were already watching them. But we needed solid evidence of the conspiracy, and we needed to identify all the players before we could act. Including Mayor Jacobson, Samuel said, understanding dawning in his voice. Especially Jacobson. The mayor has been providing Tolliver with information about cattle shipments and ranch security for over a year. In exchange, Tolliver shared a percentage of his profits and eliminated ranchers who asked too many questions. Chief Running Bear stepped forward, his weathered face stern. You let my daughters face death to catch these criminals? Martinez had the grace to look ashamed. Chief, I know how this must appear to you, but if we had acted too soon, the corruption would have gone deeper underground. More innocent people would have died. And you were willing to sacrifice Swift Deer and Singing Bird to prevent that, Samuel said, his voice heavy with disapproval. We never intended to let the execution take place, Martinez insisted. The cavalry was already on its way when word reached us that you had taken matters into your own hands. Your actions simply forced us to move before we were fully ready. Tommy, who had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement, suddenly spoke up. Sheriff, what about the others? Big Jim's got men scattered all over the territory. Martinez nodded grimly. Most of them are already in custody. We've been coordinating arrests across 3 counties for the past 2 days. Tolliver's operation is finished. The judge stepped forward, clearly relieved to have the situation resolving itself in an orderly fashion. Sheriff Martinez, what are your intentions regarding the Apache prisoners? They'll be released immediately with a full apology from the territorial government, Martinez replied. Chief Running Bear, your daughters are free to return to their people with our assurance that this injustice will not be repeated. Swift Deer, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, finally spoke. What of the men who would have watched us die for their own crimes? What justice will they face? Martinez turned to look at Tolliver, who sat slumped in his saddle like a defeated giant. Big Jim Tolliver will stand trial for the murder of Tom Peterson, along with multiple counts of cattle rustling and conspiracy. His associates will face similar charges. And Mayor Jacobson? Samuel asked. A grim smile crossed Martinez's face. The mayor won't be returning from his trip to the canyon. When he realized his operation was exposed, he chose to resist arrest. Unfortunately for him, the cavalry is very good at their job. The crowd was beginning to disperse now that the drama was over. Some townspeople looked ashamed of their earlier bloodlust, while others muttered angrily about being cheated of their entertainment. Samuel noticed that several of the most vocal supporters of the execution were quietly slipping away, probably worried about their own connections to the conspiracy. Billy Williams approached Samuel, his young face a mixture of relief and embarrassment. Mr. Crawford, I want to apologize for not being stronger when those girls needed help. I was scared. Samuel placed a hand on the deputy's shoulder. Billy, you did more than most men would have done. Trying to sabotage that gallows took real courage, even if it didn't work. I kept thinking about what you said, about having to live with myself if I let innocent people die. Billy looked toward Swift Deer and Singing Bird, who were now surrounded by their father and his warriors. I'm glad they're safe. Chief Running Bear approached Samuel, his dignity intact despite everything his family had endured. Samuel Crawford, my people will remember what you did here. You risked your life for daughters who were not your own, against people who were your own color. This is the mark of a true warrior. Samuel removed his hat respectfully. Chief, your daughters showed more courage in that jail cell than most men show in their entire lives. I was honored to fight for them. The old chief studied Samuel for a long moment before speaking again. There is something you should know. The Apache arrow that was placed in Peterson's body, it was not made by any of our warriors. How do you know? Running Bear gestured toward one of his men who stepped forward carrying a quiver of arrows. Because our arrows are marked with symbols that identify the maker. The arrow in Peterson was made by a white man who learned our techniques but did not understand our traditions. Samuel felt a chill as the implications hit him. You mean Tolliver or one of his men actually made that arrow specifically for the frame-up? Yes, they planned this deception very carefully. It was not a crime of opportunity, but a calculated murder designed from the beginning to blame my people. The revelation added another layer of premeditation to Tolliver's crimes, making his eventual punishment even more certain. Samuel realized that the rustlers' operation had been far more sophisticated and malicious than he had initially suspected. Sheriff Martinez overheard the conversation and nodded grimly. That fits with what we've learned from our investigation. Tolliver has been studying Apache customs and techniques for months, specifically to use them against innocent people. He even had one of his men learn to make arrows in the traditional style. Tommy confirmed this with a reluctant nod. It was Jake Morrison who made the arrows. He spent time with some peaceful Apaches up near Flagstaff, claimed he was interested in their culture. We never knew he was learning to frame them for murders. Swift Deer spoke quietly, but her words carried clearly to everyone nearby. This man Morrison, where is he now? Dead, Martinez said simply. He was one of the men who resisted arrest yesterday. Apparently he preferred bullets to hanging. The sun was now fully up, casting long shadows across the town square. The gallows stood empty, its nooses swaying gently in the morning breeze like a reminder of how close justice had come to being perverted. Samuel reflected on how many similar injustices had occurred across the frontier, times when there was no one to speak for the innocent or challenge the lies of the powerful. As the cavalry prepared to escort their prisoners to the territorial capital for trial, Samuel gathered his belongings and prepared to resume his journey. His work in Copper Ridge was done, but he knew there would be other towns, other injustices, other innocent people who needed someone to stand up for them. Chief Running Bear approached him one final time. "Samuel Crawford, you will always be welcome in the lodges of the Chiricahua Apache. If you ever need shelter, food, or warriors to fight beside you, you have only to ask." Samuel mounted his horse and touched his hat in salute. "Chief, I hope our paths cross again under happier circumstances. Give my regards to your daughters and tell them that their courage in that jail cell helped save their own lives." As Samuel rode out of Copper Ridge, he could see Swift Deer and Singing Bird in the distance, finally reunited with their people and free from the shadow of the gallows. The sight filled him with satisfaction, knowing that justice had prevailed despite the corruption and prejudice that had nearly claimed 2 innocent lives. The lone rider disappeared into the desert morning, already thinking about the next challenge that awaited him somewhere along the vast frontier. Behind him, Copper Ridge began the slow process of rebuilding its reputation and learning to live with the knowledge of how close they had come to committing an unforgivable crime. The gallows remained standing in the town square, but it would be a long time before the people of Copper Ridge were eager to use it again.